I'm Bob Hallock. I was born May 5th, 1949.
Fritzi Hallock. I was born November 7, 1961.
No, I was born in Minnesota. I grew up in Hibbing, Minnesota, a town of about 17,000 people. My father was also born there, and we had about 150 Jews and one teeny synagogue. I came to Baltimore in 1979. I went to college on the East Coast, Philadelphia, D.C., and eventually settled in Baltimore.
I grew up here. I went away for college, but then came back right after school. On both sides, my grandmother came after she graduated from college. My father's mother, she met my father's father here, and his parents had come, and some of his older siblings had emigrated in the late 1880s. All of the emigration was the late 1880s. I think we've researched that one from all the branches, and eventually Baltimore. And the only of my grandparents not having made a home in Baltimore was my mother's mother, but my grandfather married her out of Pittsburgh, I think, or Philadelphia, and brought her here. So she was an import. But both of my parents were raised in Baltimore.
Well, we were fixed up by a mutual friend, but we were on a committee together. It was called at the time the Associated Way Downtown Forum, and it met monthly downtown to bring in young professionals to hear topics of interest that were not necessarily religious in nature.
Over lunch during the week.
Mm-hmm. We met in law firm in the 1980s, mid 80s, and we were both on the committee. And I was old and she was young. But
right, so I didn't know he was like an old guy. And I might have been 22, 23, 24, my very early years. And I, at the time, being new back to Baltimore after college, had joined the Jewish Big Brother Big Sister League, and was a big sister, where I met someone who was on the board whose name was David Paulson. And David was also friends with Bob. And so when David suggested that I was like, he's the old guy on the Associated Way, and I guess, I don't know what you said about me.
So he set us up on we met for lunch. Very different than growing up in Baltimore, obviously. Northern Minnesota, lots of lakes, a lot of Scandinavians, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and then there was us. My grandfather emigrated there. My grandparents emigrated there in the 1880s, 1890s, and I don't really know why, but they settled in northern Minnesota, as did some other Jews. They were generally peddlers, and my grandfather set up a men's clothing store in 1900, and it continued there for 80 years. We had a small synagogue. My grandfather was the first president of our synagogue in about 1906. My grandmother was the first president of the Council of Jewish Women around the same time, and they were very active in Jewish life. So that's what I grew up with, and it was a very tight-knit Jewish community. And philanthropy, we had, we didn't have a local federation, but at the high holidays, they would, from the Bima, they would ask people to make their pledges in the open, and they would call out families, and people would say what they were doing. So that's what I remember about philanthropy.
I grew up in Northwest Baltimore City and went to public schools where and this is from a child's point of view, you were either black or you were Jewish. So it was every person I knew who was not black was Jewish, and so it was a very warped, I guess, sense of what the world was like, but very comfortable and a delicious childhood that way. So that I felt, whereas you had a sense of the other, I had a sense of, a very, everyone in my neighborhood, and so it was pretty great. But the philanthropy, my parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, I know now that they did, and I learned as an adult that they did, but it was not part of what we experienced growing up. It was not part of that for me. I think so my first understanding of volunteering and doing for others was I would go with my mother when I was really little. She would read to patients at Levendale. and I would say, who are we visiting? And she, is this a cousin? Is this an uncle? She said, no, we were just doing this because they were blind people living in the nursing home, and we were going to read to them. And it was my first little inkling of doing community service, and just because it was a good thing to do. And I learned from that. And then my father was always volunteering in different, he was actually on the board and eventually president of Levendale, also the Associated, as I was a young person, a young adult. And I would say, where's Dad? Why isn't he home for dinner? Or what is this meeting about? What is he doing? So I started to learn about it, and to say this was another way. You can read to the blind in the nursing home, or you can volunteer and be on boards also. So it just seemed to be something that we did. My aunt was chair of the women's campaign one year when I was, I think, in college. And she solicited me for the first time. We were driving in the car, and she said, it would be very good if you contributed. And I was like, okay. No one had ever asked me before. So it just seemed to be part of the culture of what our family did. It wasn't overtly part of my experience as a child, but it was just, this is who we are, what we do.
I had the same thing, actually, because my parents didn't really discuss it like we do with our children. We talk about a lot of things like that, but they just did it. So I just observed them serving in various capacities. So it was nothing special. It was just, that's what we do.
Well, so I was newly back to Baltimore after college and single, and it wasn't for dating. I just wanted to develop new friendships because part of this, we had moved when I was in middle school to Columbia, Maryland. So my high school years are there. So when I moved to Baltimore and I was living back in Baltimore, my friends were not in town. So I kind of landed here and became a big sister, and found through the community of other big brothers and sisters, some of whom are still my friends to this day, a way to give back and be involved and have elements to my social life. And through that, heard about Young Leadership and did Young Leadership as a program, and I was off. The social life was there, and again, still to this day are many of the friends we met through my time, and Bob will talk about his time. It was a great way to build community for me, and to start learning about the different things that the organized Jewish community can do, both at the agency level and at the federation level, and then eventually learning about nationally and overseas over time.
I think I got involved with the Associated because I had heard that there were some events, singles events. So I had very high. It wasn't a very high goal. I was just looking to meet girls, and so there were socials and things like that. And then one of my friends suggested the Associated Way Downtown Forum, which was great for me because I wasn't involved I was in my mid-30s, and I wasn't involved in any synagogue to speak of at the time. I belonged to a synagogue, but wasn't really involved, nor was I involved in Jewish life. So I really liked getting together with young professionals downtown. I met a slew of people, we both did, that we never knew before, people with interests far beyond just Jewish issues, interest in the world, science, politics, medicine, all kinds of subjects. And we met once a month, but then many of us became friends and just knew each other for years. This went on for, 2 or 3 years?
Oh, the Associated Way was longer. It was much of the 80s.
So just met a lot of people, which was many of whom are the bedrock of who we know today.
Mm-hmm. Well, missions, I think we each went on missions as single people, separate. We weren't on the same mission, and they were similar mission. I mean, the one I went on was a few days in Poland, and then we landed in Israel, and that whole experience to give context to the importance of Israel and then the history that happened in Eastern Europe, which was part of my family story, was really important. But the geography part of it didn't have to be an associated mission. What was really important was there were 30 of us, 40 of us, 50 of us. It was one bus. And I knew a half a dozen pretty well, but got to know the others. And again, develop that community, those relationships that have lasted over the last 30, 40 years. So it was a really important threshold as a mission. And I'll talk about is we went when our daughter was 13 with other families of kids about that age and more on a family mission. And we'd never been to Israel together. We'd never been on a mission together, and we went with our children. And that was, both of us said we didn't need to go back to Israel for us to do. It was a first-timer kind of oriented trip, but to be there with our children and to experience it with other families that we knew and some we got to know from that trip, and have our children experience that together was a really important moment for our family.
It was a huge mission. How many, 200 people? So to this day, this is 12 years later, we're still getting people, we still see people, and they say, I think we were on the mission together. And we go like, were you on that mission? Because we had multiple buses, and we really got to know best the people on our bus, which was, by the way, the best bus. It was the blue bus. But there were a lot of other people on that mission to this day that share similar experiences.
My biggest change came professionally. I was hired, or my firm was hired to do a market study for Chai and the Associated. They were thinking, this was in the 80s, they wanted to take a look to try to quantify the need for senior housing in the Jewish community. And there was the Concord House at the time, was what it was called, which was part of Levendale originally, and then went to Chai. And the thought was, how much more of this could our community stand to have created, and do we see a path for doing that? And so this was a professional job for me, but I got to work with Chai in that way and got to know Ken Galula and others there. And I said, this is something I really want to be a part of. And eventually I joined the board at Chai and ended up rising to be president of Chai myself. Not right away. It's not a Cinderella story, but over, maybe over a decade or more. But I got to also be there as the first building was built, the second building was built, all the way through. I was there for the groundbreaking of Weinberg Village out in Owings Mills, and when I drive out there today, I'm still so proud that this is part of the Associated's system, and we're there to support all those people. But remembering back to when I was just a young kid, before we were even married, and I did this work that ended up giving evidence to the need that we know is still there. So it really put a longitudinal path in terms of my professional growth and my personal growth within the Associated.
During the 90s, I was on the board of Jewish Vocational Services, and at that time there were a lot of Russians coming into Baltimore. This followed the march.
That was important. That was important for us.
When was that?
We were not dating at the time, but there's a picture. There's a picture of us at the back of a bus together.
Right.
We were not dating at the time. It was.
Was that in the 80s?
It was.
Or
It was.
90s?
Yeah. It was.
Yeah.
It was in the 80s. Natan Sharansky, and there was a whole big event on the mall in Washington, and the Associated took at least one bus.
Sharansky was there. We heard Shoshana Gardens speak. She was, as usual, spectacular. So proud of her. And so then in the 90s, a lot of Russians, once the Soviet Union opened its doors, a lot of Russians were pouring into Baltimore. This really stressed the Associated a lot. We had tremendous needs to help these people with jobs, with getting oriented, and many of them, especially the older people, did not speak English. So they may have been engineers or doctors or scientists in Russia, and they didn't necessarily have credentials for the U.S., and many of them did not speak English. So this was a real challenge for us at JVS, and we spent many meetings trying to figure out how to best help them and get them English lessons, and there were people here that were getting them furniture and apartments and all this. So it was a tremendous effort. So that was a real leadership challenge for the community. I think a lot of people tried very hard. We always could have done more, but it was a very dramatic moment in Baltimore, welcoming all these new immigrants. Around year 2000, I was on the board of UMBC Hillel. And at that time, Hillel had only one, UMBC had only one clergy on campus, and that was Amos Levy, who was a rabbi, young rabbi who's since immigrated to Israel, made Aliyah with his family. So 9/11 happened, and Amos was the only one on campus that was part of clergy. So he single-handedly brought people together, and they weren't Jewish services. They were, brought the whole campus together. So it was tremendously important for UMBC to have him there at that time.
Because we're in Baltimore, and my family's in Baltimore on both sides, and Bob, when we got married, there already was a standing schedule of holidays and who hosts what holidays. And I'll let him talk about the Passover part of it. But for me, I got to be in the same community with my grandmother, and I now use her china when I'm doing things, or the silverware that my mother had, I now have that I can use for those holidays. And so there's a whole element of, with my children, trying to show them that. So the story that really has come to mind about it, I'm not one who devotes a lot of time to cooking, but I do cook, but I don't devote it. But my mother made blintzes every year for breakfast for Yom Kippur. That was her thing. She always said to me, "You gotta come, learn how to make them, learn how to make them." I said, no, but Amanda will come, so my daughter. So Amanda went every year from when she was old enough to be able to do it, and help my mother make them. During college, she would bring friends home for the holidays, and they would make them. So my daughter knows how to make the blintzes. So my mother passed away, and it's time to have breakfast again, and I'm like, oh my God, I've got to make the blintzes. I don't know how to do it. So I got in touch with my daughter, who lives out of town, and I said, we're going to make the blintzes. You're going to make them, and you're going to teach me. So she had put together the list of things that were in my mother's kitchen, the very important tools like the measuring spoons. I said, we've got measuring spoons. But we got all the tools together, and we got the recipe from the recipe box, and Amanda looked it over. She said, it says that, but we do this, like all the things that are not written down. And we made the blintzes together just this year, and it was such a meaningful thing. It was a recipe my mother had created. She started with a basic recipe, but over the years had become her own, that she taught to my daughter, that my daughter's now taught to me. And it's our staple. We'll now do this every year. It was really important.
Speaking of children, we ended up sending our two youngest children to Krieger Schachter Day School, which was a real stretch for both of us, because both of us went to public schools, and our parents really valued public schools. So nobody in our families were saying, you've got to send your kids to a Jewish day school, and it was very foreign to us. I happened to go on a trip to Eastern Europe with Fritzi's father, John Kolker, and it became apparent to me on the trip, it just hit me that I needed to do more for my children in terms of educating them in a Jewish way. So I came back from the trip and I said to Fritzi, guess what? I'm really considering sending Amanda, who was our first between us child, to Jewish day school. And Fritzi says, what? So we went and looked at it, and we're just really blown away by the education at Krieger Schachter and the caring and the energy. So both Amanda and Charlie, our two youngest, went to Krieger Schachter Day School, and that really helped change our family, because neither of us was that knowledgeable religiously. So we learned a great deal through our children, and then we also decided, as many young parents of young families do, to get more involved in our synagogue, which is his Gemuna. And so we started going to Shabbat services with our kids to set a good example for them, and there were just great family services at his Gemuna. So that also became a part of our community. So having children really brought us much more into certain areas of the Baltimore community that we would have never been a part of before.
Like with Chai, where I had a professional expertise and this was a way I could contribute, I deal with finance and investments, and I sit on the investment management committee, which oversees the endowment, the JCIF endowment, and which I love, and that is perfectly aligned with what I do in my professional life. But numbers and analysis and that kind of work is very natural to me, and I actually do enjoy it. So I sat on the finance committee, which was newly formed, or was being newly formed when I joined it, of the Associated. Pete Sachs was the chair of that committee, and one day he said to me, "You seem to ask a lot of good questions. Would you like to replace me as treasurer?" And not that day, but eventually. And so it began. I guess I could do this, and so I'm in finishing up my third year of doing it. I have one more year, and it's been great. And part of doing that at the same time, I've been moving up the ladder of the Associated Jewish Charities. So I'm the first vice president there. So in a year, when I'm no longer treasurer of the Associated, I'll become actually chair of the Associated Jewish Charities, which is really exciting to me. My aunt, Freddie Saxon, was chair many years ago, and I always was really proud that she had done that, and then to think that that's something that I'll get to do as well is really very exciting. But as Bob said, talking about the Hillel at UMBC and my board work at Chai, and I was also on the board of the Big Brother Big Sister League. I think having the agency as a reference point and what agencies do, and the hand-to-hand work every day with clients of whether it's the JCC, which is dealing with large groups of people and big cohorts, or Jewish Vocational Services, where get one person a job this week. The scale of the work from small to large is so important to understand and know when you're doing calling cards on a Super Sunday, or sitting on a planning and allocation committee and deciding how much an agency is going to get, or should we give more to the day schools, or what about this Israel and Overseas program is important. To really understand it from the side of the work that gets done, as well as the donors who are there to contribute the money, and matching the donor intent or interest or passion with the work that needs to happen. That's almost where the magic's made. So we both spoke to the idea that doing volunteer work or philanthropy was just something that was in our families when we were growing up. We were different with our children, and we involved them really very early in ways that were right for them. And so the one that sticks out to me was we volunteered as a family for Chai for their neighborhood day, whatever they called it. It was a volunteer day. And what that meant was we showed up, we were given an address and a list of things that needed to be done with our kids. And it might have even just been with our daughter, because I'm thinking she might have been 4 or 5, and our son might not even have been born yet. And while we were putting plastic coating on this man's windows and turning a mattress or caulking a bathroom, she was playing and entertaining him and talking to him and visiting, doing a visit. That and we didn't say to her, do it. We probably just said, this is what we're doing today. And she still talks about how we did that. And we did other things from there, but I still remember the house. I still remember the man, and
Our
how
kids still talk about it. They remember it very clearly. We were having, I don't know if it's the same man you were talking to, we were over at this man's house raking his leaves, and we became aware that there were some problems with him medically. And he lived alone like many of these older people do. So right while we were there, we called the Associated and said, there's an issue here, and they got somebody right on it. We also were at a lady's house, and she had cookies for us. I mean, people couldn't have been nicer. And she wanted to show us all the pictures of her family, many of whom perished in the Holocaust. And so it became not just raking their leaves, but getting to know them. And they just loved seeing us as young adults, and certainly our children come to their homes. So it was a way also, back to this man, for the Associated to realize what people in the community may have needed help. And he never knew that we did that, but it was a nice subtle way of having our eyes and ears in the community to see who needed help.
in terms of what I'm doing now, I think very much about my grandmother, my father's mother, who was very active also in the National Council of Jewish Women, was her big thing, and Hadassah. And she was always going to meetings, always doing, not just being, but doing. And it was an important posture in terms of how you address life, to do things that were important to you, but that could be meaningful to others. I think some of it came out of her early career as a social worker, that she had that orientation, and so it didn't inspire me to do what I do, but it informs how I think about doing it. That it just becomes part of how I think about going about this work.
I think both my parents certainly influenced me. I saw what they did, and they didn't know, of course, like many children, they didn't know what I was seeing. So they just did their thing, and I observed. I also, since that time, I've come across papers from my grandparents, and have shared these with my children. My grandmother apparently was active in the 1930s, especially in speaking out to help brothers and sisters in Europe. And she gave speeches. This is in northern Minnesota. I mean, who would ever think? But she talked about helping the victims of the Nazi regime, and that we cannot let fellow Jews down. And she encouraged people to put money in the pushka and raise funds for children and for adults over there. So I've since shared that with my children, because I want them to know this is not just me, it's generations of Jews helping other Jews. I think it's powerful. We are really the front lines to do it. I mean, certainly there's agencies of the government that can do certain things, but ultimately we have to take care of our own. We go, certainly at the Associated, we go far beyond what any government agency can do. We take care of our people, not just if they're at the worst situation, but even in situations where they need a little bit of help. So we don't have strict guidelines in terms of who we help and who we don't help. It's a very broad net, and that's why I think it's important that we take care of our own, not to the exclusion of everybody else, but we are one community. I explained to my non-Jewish friends that we are different in the sense that we're not only a religion, but we're also a people. We're raised to believe that all Jews around the world are our brothers and sisters, our family. So that's how we approach it. When I moved to Baltimore, the impression many people had is Baltimore is very ingrown, very hard to break into. And some people still say that today, because we are blessed with having multi-generation families active in synagogues, active at the Associated, like Fritzi's family. But I rapidly found out that Baltimore, first of all, there are a lot of transplants in Baltimore. And if people want to get involved, just jump in, because there's tons of opportunities. So I would say don't hang back, jump in, and there are ample opportunities. And through your involvement, you can get much more integrated into the community. And years later, even though I'm not from Baltimore, a lot of people have no idea, because I've been here a long time, I've been involved through years, and don't be shy, because I found the Baltimore community actually very welcoming to anybody who wants to work and do good.
And there's so many ways you can plug in. I mean, I started out as a big sister, the Big Brother Big Sister League, but there was the Associated Way luncheons. That was another way. The JCC used to have dances. We'd go to the dances. There was the Superphone Days, and you can do work in campaign, young leadership. The program now called Impact, which is dealing with the people in that generation. There's so many needs, and if you've got an interest and show up, you'll be there. You really will. We had, again, it was just something that they always did. I'm going through my mother's things I found and I gave to Michelle Gordon. My mother, for a time, was the editor of, there was a newsletter that the women's, whatever it was called at the time, the women put out, and it went, and I loved looking at it because the first ones she edited, they would list on the masthead, if you will, and it would say, Mrs. Sam Cohen, Mrs. Bernard Smith, and it would do like that. And then eventually, over like 3 or 4 years, then the women got their own names. People didn't change, but just how they listed the names. And it was wonderful to see. But I think my memories started really as a young adult. Remember, we had moved to Columbia, so I really didn't see on a daily basis what was going on at the Associated. But I remember there was some opening of a building or a wing at Levendale. My father, he might have been there because of his Levendale connection, but he was maybe chairman of the board of the Associated at the time. And he was there for the groundbreaking of the ribbon cutting. And I was like, I'll come. And I might have been home from college that weekend. And it was the first time I saw, what is this organization? Who does this work? And what are they doing? And what is it about? And that was the first time I saw what my father was doing with his volunteer time and started to have conversations with him about it. I really wasn't ready to receive it much before then. And then it just took off from there. And my memories of, I had a really good friend who was very involved in the women's department, an older woman, and she invited me to a program. And I remember Carol Seibel and other women who I didn't really know at the time singing some song that they had written maybe to Hello Dolly, but their own words. And I thought, who are these women? And trying to connect that women's event with the singers, with cutting a ribbon at a Levendale new wing that was opening, really, and all the possibilities that was there, and being maybe within the same 2 or 3 year period at a Big Brother Big Sister League board meeting where we were talking about our budgeting allocation, and I was like, who gets to decide this? And they said those same people who were doing all these things, and it really opened my eyes to the depth and breadth of what the Associated and the agency system does.
I have a Carol Seibel story also,
Okay.
because she was on the board with me at Jewish Vocational Services, and
She ended up being president there, yeah?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think she did.
So Carol Seibel was sitting there at the meeting, and Carol was the first to say, she says, I don't know anything about finances, all these budgets, I don't understand the numbers. And she sort of played that to her advantage, and we were discussing all these Russians pouring into Baltimore. We didn't have enough money, we didn't have enough people, we didn't have enough resources, and so we were talking about how do we serve these people with the limited resources that we have. And Carol had enough in the meeting, and she said, I don't really care about any of this. She says, it is unacceptable for us not to be able to serve them. We've got to find the money, find the resources. And that was like, whoa. So Carol spoke, and that's where community volunteers can make a huge difference. The Associated has a fabulous staff, but volunteers really push the envelope. And I'm sure we are exasperating to staff sometimes, because we come up with ideas that are not necessarily here at the Associated, but it really makes everything much healthier. There's a lot of give and take, and the staff pushes volunteers, and volunteers push the staff. So I think it's a good system, and I've been so impressed with Associated staff being supportive of volunteers. A lot of organizations don't have nearly the quality of staff that the Associated does, and I think the staff really makes the volunteers look good. So I appreciate it.
I can talk about Lou Jacobs, who was head of Big Brother Big Sister League, and then Marcy Kolodny at the time, who ended up being president there. They were early mentors. And then Ken Galula at Achai and all of that. But the one I really remember, because I was really young figuring out, was Howard Feinberg. So Howard was staff here at the Associated and dealt with all the young leadership type programs. And his answer to everything was yes, everything was possible, and he was a great guide. He was like a tour guide to what being a young Jewish volunteer could be, and came from a really, he was a much more observant, and he was a man and much more observant, and yet here I was, this young woman, and I never felt any difference between us, and it was a great, he was he took me as I was and led me through. So I really,
both of us, Howard.
Yeah, intimately. So
I would echo that.
He was really super. certainly in my early
Mhm.
volunteer time. The Associated has always been there. I mean, I think that's part of, for me, when I say it was not a remarkable thing that when I was young that the Associated was where my parents volunteered, because it was always there. And when I came back to Baltimore, it was the first place I called to volunteer with my free time in my 20s. And it's not surprising that when Bob was young, new in Baltimore, that was where he came. It was there as a place to volunteer, to make a difference, but also to receive back. We've been clients, we've been fundraisers, we've been volunteers, we've been on boards as well as doing direct service work. And as we've grown and changed in our lives, and our family, grown, and now our family's gone, we have more time, different time. The Associated's there, differently, being involved differently. We no longer think that would be a good thing to do with the kids. We should really do that. It's really more of where do our skills and our interests lie, in a way that can make a difference, that makes sense. And so it's, again, it's a very good time in our lives, and I think a good time to give back to many places.
I'm always amazed how broad the Associated's mission is in terms of how many different types of organizations and people the Associated helps. And I would say to people that are starting out, it's not perfect. So, I mean, a lot of people can criticize organizations. The Associated, why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do this better? Why, all kinds of things. But when you think of all the Associated does, it's really quite incredible. And the Associated, to its credit, is also evolving tremendously over the years. So that when you think of what Jewish life was like before there was a federation that could take financial contributions and spread them throughout the community in ways that we would have no idea. There's so many organizations and people and entities that the Associated helps that if it were just up to Fritzi and me, we would have no idea that they even existed or had needs. So it's a tremendous asset to the community having such a strong federation. So we're really quite proud to be associated with the Associated.